And Scott Horton, what about this issue of the what happens from here on in, and also the choices that President Obama has? Does he name a more moderate justice and then really make it difficult for the Republicans to continue to block a nomination, or does he attempt to go to a more liberal justice and really sharpen in the upcoming election the choices that voters have when they're electing a president?
Well, to me, the political elements here have never been sharper for the Supreme Court. So I think we're going to see this whole issue of the Supreme Court front and center in the election campaign for the new president. It's always there in the final rounds of the election. We usually have candidates saying who is selected now as president will determine the makeup of the Supreme Court. And now we're in a position where that literally is going to be true. So it will be central. As for Obama's options, it seems to me he's going to play a tactical game at this point, knowing what the position is of the Republican majority and their leader. And it seems to me the Republicans have put themselves in a position in which they're going to be subject to ridicule based on their own conduct. I think it's likely that Obama will put forward the nomination of a moderate with outstanding credentials and probably someone who has recently been approved by the same Republican Senate by a strong vote, and watch them cope with that. Because I think if their tactic is simply to block, that's not going to help them in the presidential election.
And what would be some of those, who would be some of those potential folks that he might name?
Well, Sri Srinivasan, I think, is the most commonly cited figure right now. But I think we've got a group principally of Court of Appeals judges who were approved over his 2 terms as president, who've gotten substantial support, including support from Republicans. There are a half dozen of them in the holding pen right now. Any of them may be put forward. But I doubt it's going to be the left equivalent of Antonin Scalia. It's going to be someone who is more of a moderate, more of a centrist, someone who in normal times would be able to count on Republican support.
Ian Millhiser, can you talk more about Sri Srinivasan, who he is and his significance?
Sure. I mean, Sri is, I've seen him argue cases before. He's one of the most brilliant litigators of his generation, truly breathtaking intellect. He also, though, clerked for 2 Republican judges, for a Republican Court of Appeals judge, and then for Sandra Day O'Connor on the Supreme Court. He spent many years of his careers at a major corporate law firm, so he's very much perceived as a sort of middle-of-the-road, moderate, the sort of candidate a Democrat would put up if they wanted to extend an olive branch and say, look, like, I'm going to meet you halfway here by picking someone who wouldn't necessarily be a Democrat's first choice, but someone who everyone agrees is an extraordinary intellect, someone who was confirmed 97-0. The first, when he was confirmed to his current job on the second highest court on the land. And so I think Shri's going to be attractive to the White House. There's some other candidates, Paul Watford on the Ninth Circuit.
Just on Sri Srinivasan, he would be the first Indian American. He's young. He's 48 years old. Labor unions were not thrilled when he went up to this court, not feeling that his history of representing corporate clients would bode well for them.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, what you're looking at with Sri, and, again, the fact that he had certain kinds of clients as a lawyer doesn't necessarily predict how he's going to act as a judge or a justice. But everything we know about him now tells us brilliance and centrism.
Can you talk about Paul Watford?
Sure. Judge Watford is a judge on the Ninth Circuit. He has a similar resume to Sri. He worked at a corporate law firm for many years. Unlike Sri, Judge Watford was a clerk for Justice Ginsburg. So he has a similar profile of someone who's been at the top of the profession since the beginning of his career, a great intellect, someone who shouldn't be perceived as a bomb thrower and should be perceived as more of an olive branch because he spent most of his career not doing anything that's really associated with liberalism, just, going out there and making money as a lawyer. So if it's Watford, if it's Srinivasan, if it's either of those judges, under normal circumstances, that would be an olive branch to the Republicans.
And Linda Hirschman, can you talk about Kamala Harris, Attorney General of California, running for Senate again to fill Barbara Boxer's seat?
Right. She would be my selection if she's, if she passes the vetting process, because I would just love to see the next several months occupied with a bunch of old white male Republicans pounding on the first Asian American, African American female Attorney General of the state of California. But I think that it's mostly about the optics. As I listened to my colleagues just now discussing the pros and cons of the olive branch possibilities and so forth, I think that none of this really matters at all, because the Republicans, as far as I've been able to observe, do not care about the universe of perfect logic. And the fact that Srinivasan was confirmed 97-0 just recently is an argument which reasonable people would make, but I don't think it matters. I think that this is about power and optics. And if you are going to be realistic about what's going to happen, then you have to think about who would make the most optically advantageous appointment. And I think Kamala Harris would be very high on my list of people who would do that. That being said...
I'm sorry, another person who's been mentioned is Jane Kelly from the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals. Could you talk about her?
I would be inclined more in the direction of an African American woman like Kamala Harris. I don't think that it's about the woman thing right now.
Because
I think that getting African Americans to go to the polls in sufficient numbers to elect a Democrat President of the United States is the critical political issue right now. Obama's numbers from 2008 to 2012 went down among Hispanics and whites, and only a robust African-American vote was effective in 2012. So I'm thinking politically about this. The Republicans are looking at their red states. Arizona, for example, where I live in the winter, will be in the very liberal 9th Circuit. They're looking at their constituents living under the governance of very liberal blue circuits. And they are looking at I want them to look at the most attractive, politically attractive possible nominee.
I wanted to ask Scott Horton, with the current split in the court, we've got all these big cases coming up this term, have to be decided by June. What is your sense of what the fallout will be on some of these cases, if any, that the court may go ahead with?
Well, I think labor unions can breathe a huge sigh of relief right now, because they were probably looking at a really powerful adverse ruling on the union dues issue coming in one major case. And one fundamental rule here is it doesn't matter how the justices voted in conference or the discussions that went on. The vote that's taken has got to be the vote as it existed at the time the ruling is handed down. So nothing that's happened up to this point matters. We're dealing with an 8-member court on all of these rulings. But I think coming back to what Ian said at the beginning, we're looking at a court that is likely simply to uphold the rulings below. So in cases where, as in the immigration rights case and the voting rights cases coming out of Texas, where there's a conservative ruling from a conservative court of appeals that's likely to be sustained still, I think, and where it was a more progressive ruling, that will be upheld.
Ian Millhiser, before we go to break, if you could talk about what Justice Scalia is known for, whether we're talking about his support for gun rights, his opposition to same-sex marriage and LGBTQ rights, whether we're talking about abortion, talk about his history, this history of man who was pointed by Ronald Reagan.
Sure. I mean, I think that Justice Scalia is a very tragic figure. I mean, if you read a lot of his scholarship, he would articulate a theory of judicial restraint that I think is admirable, this notion that we should be cautious about courts getting too involved in our lives and that we are a democracy and democracy should rule. As a scholar, I think he made very interesting arguments, but as a judge, he often lacked the character and the self-control to live up to the arguments he made as a scholar. So, you know, the two most striking examples of this are the two Obamacare cases, where in the first one he joined a vicious dissent to his own opinion in another case called Race, and then in the second one he attacked his own theory of statutory interpretation that he laid out in a 2012 book. So he was a great scholar. I wish that he'd been able to live up to his own ideals, but unfortunately, all too often, I think he let ideology and partisanship get in the way of some of the more idealistic notions that he articulated as a scholar.
And Scott, I'd like to ask you about the irony of Scalia being a proponent of originalism, of faithfulness to the letter of the Constitution, and yet now the Republican majority saying, well, the president should not really exercise the powers that the Constitution gives him to name the next Supreme Court justice.
Well, I think it is highly ironic. I mean, you know, this was a politically driven conservatism, and I think Scalia's conservatism is unlike what we've seen through most of American history. He's sort of a Southern European throne and altar type of conservative, and not the sort of more progressive conservative that embraces some liberal values we've seen through most of American history. And he came up with a formula that would sustain that, which was to try and freeze the country in time constitutionally at 1789, which was a framework that gave him more ballast for his arguments, but certainly didn't help him win every case. But I think, you know, his zeal, he undermined himself with his own zeal over and over again. You know, especially in the last few years, he would attack the majority on case after case, saying XYZ is the consequence of their opinion, and you'll see. And of course, that comment was then used by district courts to sustain a more radical interpretation of the majority's opinion, and that hastened things along, like marriage equality.
We're going to break, then come back to this discussion. I want to thank Ian Millhiser for joining us, editor of Think Progress Justice, author of Injustices. Linda Hirschman is staying with us, author of Sisters-in-Law, a very interesting book about Sandra Day O'Connor and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. The subtitle, How Sandra Day O'Connor and Ruth Bader Ginsburg Went to the Supreme Court and Changed the World. And we're joined by Scott Horton, human rights attorney and lecturer at Columbia Law School. Kimberly Crenshaw will now be joining us as well from UCLA in California. This is Democracy Now! We're talking about the death of Justice Scalia and what happens next. Stay with us.